Hey, 48 North friends and fans, editor Joe Cline here with Chuck Skewes, a vastly experienced offshore sailor and owner of 3 West Coast Ullman sales lofts in Puerto Vallarta, San Diego, and right here in the Pacific Northwest. Chuck is one of the rare and wonderful people who gets to boast that he sails more miles every year than he drives his car. And as a co-founder and my co-leader of the 48 North Cruising Rally, every year Chuck and I have gotten to spend a lot of time together bringing new people into the world of cruising and bringing with it some of the aspirations that come with that. So one conversation that we've had on a number of occasions has to do with what makes for a good first offshore experience. And so today I'd like to ask Chuck a few questions about that and have him share some of his really immense knowledge about ocean sailing with the 48 North audience. So Chuck, take it away. What makes for a good first offshore experience?
Good question. I've had a lot of talks about this because since I do so much offshore racing, I get the question, hey, I want to do Transpac or I want to do Pacific Cup. And these are people that have not really done any offshore racing. And one of my big advice on this is that you don't take what is most likely going to be a 12-day race offshore as your very first one. Because there's people that I know that have done 2- and 3-day events, and then they do a 12-day to Hawaii, and they're like, I think I like the 2- or 3-day ones. And, a lot of the things that come about are things you don't really think of. And I have a little thing I tell people, like, we're going to be in the size of Ted Kaczynski's cabin with 8 people for 12 days without the ability to go walk through the woods. So pick those people correctly that you're going to go do that with.
Nice. So if it's not a 12-day race to Hawaii, can you talk us through what some of the other alternatives look like if it's a 2- or 3-day race event or possibly cruising opportunities? What are some specific examples of alternatives to that race to Hawaii for the first go?
Like it depending on your experience level, if you're a real hardcore racer, there's some great races. I would start with things like if you're in the Northwest Oregon offshore, that's a good example, because you find that if you spent your whole life racing in Puget Sound and the Straits, until you actually get out in the ocean, lots of people don't know they actually get seasick, and that's a real thing. Even when I race to Cabo, people don't get seasick, but they get seasick on Transpac. So, and I can't actually explain that. It's just that it's so many days of pounding up wind that on that first couple of days of Transpac that I think gets people. But one of the best races you can do as to really test your offshore sailing and to know whether this is something you want to do is the Cabo race. And it's anywhere, if you're on a fast boat, it's 3.5 days. If you're on a slow boat, it might be as much as 4 or 5. And it is a great race. It's generally better wind. It's warmer sooner. It doesn't have the upwind element to it. But you get into the shifts. Like if you do a race that's only 150 miles, like a 130-mile Newport Ensenada race, you're not out there long enough to get into the 4 hours on, 4 hours off to know how people deal with fatigue and or seasickness. So once you get into the longer race where you lose track of the days, I call it off the boat dreaming. When the first time you get a dream that isn't you sailing, that's when you've actually finally got into the realm of all those shifts. Like you're getting into true REM sleep, and you're getting into where you can go in indefinitely for that amount of time.
How long does that take for you, Chuck? And has it always been rapid, or is it a long process? How do you see it manifest itself for other people?
Yeah, it used to take me about 2 days, 2 solid days, like full 48 hours. Now I sail enough that I can get into it. I can actually go to sleep at 4 o'clock the first day and wake up and go at midnight. But I do this a lot. So it's kind of like I can't go in and drill someone's tooth and put a filling in. I'm sure I could if I had all day, but some guy does it in 2 hours. So it just matters on how much you actually do it. But I would plan on it being a solid 2 days. You have to be at least 48 hours in before you really get a feel for what it's going to be like out there. it's a lot like Groundhog's Day. Once you get past day 2, there's a lot of days that are exactly the same. Matter of fact, you don't even know not only what day it is or what day of the week it is. You don't know what time of day it is. You don't remember when you wake up at 8, if that's 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. So you end up, and that's really what the mode you want to get into, because you don't want it to matter whether it's day or night.
And in your experience, does that build up to where you're actually in the rhythm of the offshore life? Does that happen similarly in both racing context and cruising context? I know you have experience in both.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the first leg of the Baja Ha, and I do that every year, is from San Diego to Turtle Bay, which is about, I think it's 380 miles or something, but the boats are much slower. So we get into that realm. You know, it takes us almost 3 days to get there, 2.5 days to get there on most boats. And you're clearly into those shifts by the time you get there. You're not into like the way you feel at 12 days in Hawaii. Like then you're kind of looking forward to hitting land. When you're going to Turtle Bay, that you're still into it, but you're into that shift work, and it's pretty stable. And that's actually, if you're not a Grand Prix racer, those cruising rallies, like you know, you have the Koho that comes from Seattle down to San Francisco. You have the SoCal Tata, which are much shorter legs, but then you have the Baja Ha, which that one has really long legs, and you'll get a true feeling of what it's like to be offshore and dealing with the seasickness or the same amount of people in a crowd on a small boat.
Nice. Well, and thinking about getting into those opportunities, whether it is racing or cruising, as you mentioned, the people you're going sailing with are really important. So what do you personally look for in terms of offshore people or people to share the offshore experience with, whether it's skipper or crew or both?
Yeah, it's a combination, and sometimes the boat owner is very passive, so they're not as big a factor as the other people on the boat. But you generally want to look for people that don't have vices, you know, like a heavy smoker or a heavy drinker. Those things, when you go offshore, any problems they have can be amplified. I'm not saying that everybody that's a heavy smoker and heavy drinker is a hard time offshore, but if they have tendencies to have issues, it's going to be amplified offshore. Or someone who that's very stubborn in their political views or something, those things are going to grate on you. You know, no matter how much you can put up with them in a bar, you just walk outside or walk home or get in the car and go home. When you're on the boat, it's a 24/7. So you want to kind of get people, you know, sense of humor is important. If you're a Grand Prix racer, you want someone that has the desire to win. Because there's so many times where you can kind of just slack off and sit down and not trim the sails and start losing races. And if you're really competitive, that's when it's going to start hurting you. And then, so those are the type of things that you need to really look at when you're looking at people to go sailing with. Now, when you're going cruising, you want someone that can just deal with adversity. And I always look for someone who's a problem solver. You know, you can pick them out. There's people that say, oh, I can't do it because of this. And then there's people that say, oh, this isn't working, but if we do this, we can make it work. Those are the people you want offshore, because things are going to break, things are going to wear out, you're going to have trouble. So whoever can problem solve is definitely going to be higher on my list of people I want to go offshore with.
Nice. That's great advice.
We got work going on in the background.
Yeah, it's okay. The sail loft is still in operation, in part because you guys are making masks, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Good. Well, good for you for doing that. So thinking about those problem solver attributes or other things, other ways that sailors could sort of develop themselves into more desirable offshore crew, whether it is racing or cruising, what are some inshore opportunities that sailors can engage in to sort of build themselves up toward making themselves good hands in an offshore setting?
That was a loud one. So probably the most important thing is sailing at night. You know, that is the most difficult part of offshore sailing. And all the disasters I've had offshore have all happened between midnight and 4 a.m. You know, it's the crew's a little tired. If the moon sets and the sun sets, it's a really difficult to see the horizon, you know, especially if there's any clouds, and it's just a blackout condition. So you get off course, and that's when the spinnaker wraps or things like that. And what's interesting enough is once you get 25 miles out or 50 miles out or 100 miles out, generally the windiest time you have in any of these offshore races is at night. And so the difficulty goes up, your skill level goes down, your ability to deal with problems is less, you know. So but sailing at night is really hard. Some people actually get vertigo. I would say a good 20% of the people, when there's no light and no reference, like no stars or anything, they get a kind of a vertigo thing, and they'll start spinning the boat right and left and not be able to sail the boat. So those are things that you need to know before you get into a race situation.
Chuck, what advice do you have for the people who do find themselves in hopefully a fairly short offshore experience, but they are having those problems, whether it's with fatigue, seasickness, vertigo because of the darkness at night? How do you frame the challenge that they may be experiencing in the moment in the context of hopefully them being able to get through it and find the enjoyment in offshore sailing?
Well, one of the things I think is you think ahead a little bit. Like, you know, they make, I don't get seasick, like, and I sail a lot of miles, but I still, before the really big races, I'll put on one of those scopolamine patches. And I recommend you test one of those patches out at home on a weekend when you have no plans, because some people have some kind of crazy adverse effects on them, and some people like me have zero effect from them. And so I recommend that you do that, because seasickness is one of those, it's not like you can just teleport off the boat. You're dealing with it for a long time, and it makes you miserable, and then it starts making other people miserable. And you take an already short-handed crew and make them even more short-handed. So I think by picking your crew and having problem solvers, knowing the strengths of everybody on the boat so that you have an all-hands position would give you more confidence in dealing with the problems that you have when in the middle of the night. You know, we're pretty diligent on most of the boats I race on, and I have a small core group of guys that I prefer to race with, and we try to get each other on different programs, because it's just we work together so well that we all know exactly where we go in a disaster situation. We know who's going to go up all the way to the bow, no matter what the situation is. We had a problem. It was blowing 40 one night, and we wiped out. And imagine that. We had the biggest spinnaker on the boat up. We were pushing the boat too hard. We tried to jibe, and we wiped out. And we had two guys up on the bow, but I mean, we ended up, we broke a lot of things. But you know, once we got the mast out of the water, we were back to racing within minutes. You know, the crew just dealt with it. It wasn't like anybody was to blame. It was just like, hey, let's clean this mess up, and let's put together, and what sail do we need to put up now to keep the boat going fast, you know. So knowing who is best at which position and clarifying that first, and so when you get in those really bad situations, you're dealing with fatigue and seasickness, people step up. And generally when it really goes bad, your adrenaline wakes everybody up. The fatigue kind of goes away to some extent.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, and I think that raises an interesting question as well, Chuck. A lot of that intuitive knowledge about who's going to respond to what when things go sideways in a racing crew, I feel like that can be developed in inshore racing opportunities. And so do you find that crews who know each other really well and have a lot of experience and understanding and sort of intuition about what's going to happen on the boat in an inshore context, does that translate well to an offshore
Very
experience?
well. Yeah,
Okay.
very well. Knowing the boat is really key, so that everybody can do every position. That core group I was telling you about, anybody on the boat could go to any position and know what to do. They never had to ask a question. We all knew the boat extremely well. Anytime there was a modification to the boat, we went out and tested that modification, and everybody kind of fiddled with it, and we perfected it. And so we could wake up from a blind sleep, go to a position that maybe we weren't familiar with because there's a real big problem on the bow and you have to send 4 people forward. But we all knew what to do and how to handle it and what equipment we had to deal with it. And that's really key. So if you have the same group you're racing around the buoys with, that is where the first pick I would use for going offshore.
Great advice. Great advice. So for folks who are looking to get into it, what should first-time offshore sailors, whether they're racing or cruising, think about in terms of gear or gadgets that they should own or bring, or knowledge of systems or digital resources that they should have in terms of navigation or weather? What advice do you have there?
So generally people bring too much stuff, but you need to have, you have to have high quality thermal wear. Even for these Southern California races, the first nights are pretty cold. Not by Northwest standards, not like doing Southern Straits or something, but the first nights are pretty cold. So having really high quality thermal wear, and it's super important to have a high quality dry gear, that you're having a Musto or a Henry Lloyd or something that is extremely good, because getting wet and cold is going to take you out of the game. And guaranteed, you're going to be wet and cold even in high quality gear. So it buys you a lot more hours, and it makes a world of difference of that, of all that in the middle of the night, being able to stay awake and functioning and sailing the boat rather than worrying about personal comfort. The electronics gear that I recommend people have is the personal AISs. Now they have personal EPIRBs, which are great, but a personal EPIRB has to go from you to the satellites to the Coast Guard and back to a fleet. Personal AIS goes straight to the boat that you came from and all surrounding boats, and shows a little guy in the water going, like this little animated figure. And I think that those are almost mandatory now. I mean, I've been fortunate enough not to lose anybody, but I've been with people that have lost people, and it's not something that you're going to get over anytime soon. And it's a serious issue, and we do this for fun. And if you're doing something that's going to cause something traumatic, that's not exactly fun. So personal AISs, high quality, self-inflating life jackets. And I can't recommend enough, and if you're going to go offshore, I can't recommend enough the safety at sea seminars. 2/3 of the boat has to do them anyway. So you become a more valuable member of the crew and more likely to get on a boat if you take the safety at sea. But the 2-day live seminar, you actually take your gear and you hop in a pool or the water, and you see that sometimes it doesn't inflate, so you have to manually inflate it. They teach you how to stay warm in groups, in and out of the life raft, and how to properly operate flares. I mean, the stuff is so valuable. Now, I'm required to do these every 5 years for the racing I do, and I hardly could find time to do them, but when I do them, I'm so glad I do them. They're super valuable. I can't express enough how important those are.
Yeah, you are among a host of people who believe deeply in those. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of an experienced offshore sailor who doesn't think that's kind of the most important thing for beginning offshore sailors, is the safety at sea seminars. In terms of, just to dig back a little bit more into the electronic stuff, I know that many offshore boats are using software like Expedition,
Yes.
and constantly downloading weather, grid files, that kind of thing. How important is it for a new offshore crew, either racing or cruising, to bring some knowledge of those programs and principles to the boat?
Yeah, for cruising, having the routing isn't as important, but it's becoming more important because the weather routing now is so valuable and it's so accurate and so available. And that if you're cruising, the last thing you want to do is get out in a tropical depression or a storm or worse yet, a hurricane. And the routing software and the weather grids are going to keep you away from that sort of thing. For racing, it's absolutely mandatory. If you look at the routing, the old days where we used to do dead reckoning and sextants and things when we'd sail across and basically sail the barometer all the way to Hawaii. If you looked at the routing of boats, and because they only gave it 1 a day plots, so the routing's not quite as smooth lines as it is today, but you see that the fleet spread out like a fan. Like, it was radical at where they are now. With everyone using Expedition and the weather routing, everyone's pretty much going the same way, and you're just favoring one side of the fleet or the other. It's more like racing in a buoy race. And if you don't have that, you won't be competitive at all offshore. I mean, it is absolutely mandatory. And not only is it mandatory, it's almost mandatory that there's a dedicated crew person that does almost nothing but run it. It's a full-time job. And a lot of my success in offshore racing has been because I sail with amazing navigators. And they're called navigators, but it's really weather routing. We have a picture of the island on the chart plotter. It's not like we're going to miss Hawaii. Those days are over, And so but the weather routing things are really good. And so the guys that deliver the boat back are using this really high-end software and all these weather grids to get the best routes back. But then you see the value in cruisers, because you don't want to be out 30 knots as a cruiser, especially if you're just a couple. So you can look, if you're held up in Turtle Bay, you can look at weather and you can stay there 3 or 4 more days and get a better weather window to leave. And that's what the goal should be.
Nice. Well, and it does seem like weather is one of the biggest determinants in terms of an early offshore sailor's enjoyment. And so, what are, in terms of understanding the weather opportunities, weather windows, that kind of thing, like how would you describe weather conditions that will help make for a great first offshore experience?
And, it's really hard to beat the Southern California to Mexico races. They're pretty consistent. I mean, once in a while you get a light air one, and once in a while you get a heavy air one. But if you were to average them, they're 12 to 20 knots downwind sailing, which is epic conditions. It's rarely more than that, and it's rarely less than that. And so, going downwind, if it's a downwind race, up to 22, 23 is still very safe, manageable wind for any skill level. If there's an upwind element to it, you really want to stay under 18 knots. And sea state down here has more to do with it than anything, because we get different swells from storms that are on the other side of the ocean. And like I would say that, we had a bad race here a number of years ago, and that's because we had a 12-foot northwest swell, which is a big northwest swell. And then we had 35 knot southerly against it, and it made the waves stand up. And one or the other of those we could have handled, but we had to sail for 48 hours in just pretty bad conditions. And if we weren't racing, we would not have been out there. So.
Got it. And here in the Northwest, how do you think about conditions, weather windows, et cetera? I understand that sailing down south gives you some higher levels of consistency, and that's good. Do you have any knowledge or ideas about how Pacific Northwest sailors can sail our waters and feel most confident that they're setting themselves up for success?
Yeah, the weather is really predictable, 1 to 2 days out, and fairly predictable 3 to 4. So I would just look for things like those summer thermals that come through the straits. You're going to have great 15, 16 knots in the afternoons. Until you get near Race Rocks or something, you're going to have some 20s and stuff. So you can pick those weather windows to go sailing, and that's probably a great place to get offshore practice as well, because you do get nearly an ocean swell running through the straits there, and you get this great wind almost all night long. And so looking for, anytime you start seeing you look at the weather grids, they have the little feathers, and anytime you see the 15, that's ideal, but that's kind of the peak of your ideal. If you see two long feathers, you don't want to see 2 long feathers on there. That's 20 knots, because those are the steady wind. That doesn't include the gusts, and so the gusts are generally 30% of that. So if you have 15 knots, you're going to have 22 knot puffs. If you have 20 knots, you're going to have, you could have puffs closer to 30, which would make it uncomfortable.
Yeah, terrific. Well, that exhausts the questions that I had prepared, and I feel like that really gives people a terrific overview of how they can think about having a successful and enjoyable first trip offshore, and how they can get into it. Do you have anything you'd like to add in closing, Chuck?
Well, if we get some more people on the 48 degrees north rally this summer, maybe we'll do some weather seminars during that and kind of give some people a better idea. I look forward to that every week of the year, especially this year since everything else has been canceled. So hopefully we get going and get to go do that.
Yeah, it's on for now. So we are continuing to plan and looking forward to it as well. So. Good. Well, Chuck, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you,
Joe. Stay safe and happy down there. Thanks again for making the masks, and hopefully we'll all be out sailing together soon.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.